During the Second World War, combatants had to confront not only the adversary, but also the relentless elements. The rigid winter transformed into an invisible enemy that assaulted continuously. The frost penetrated through the uniforms, weapons solidified, and bodies suffered freezing. And even more severe, the hungry stomachs of military personnel had to battle for every single calorie. It is stated that armed forces advance thanks to their own stomach, and in glacial conditions, this principle was doubly valid. In this content, you will discover what combatants consumed in the extreme cold of the Second World War, how they managed to prepare hot nourishment in the middle of snowstorms, what desperate improvisations hunger led them to, and what surprising foods kept them alive. Shortly, we will reveal shocking narratives from the Eastern Front, but also inspiring moments of humanity, like military personnel who divided the last portion of bread and courageous cooks who distributed hot broth under enemy fire. Prepare yourselves for a journey through the frozen hell of battlefields, where every bite could decide existence and death. When General Winter is mentioned, numerous people recall the destiny of Napoleon's forces in Moscow in 1812. Hitler initially underestimated this historical lesson. He believed he would conclude the conflict before the Russian winter struck. But the cruel frosts did not choose factions and struck all combatants. Before arriving at the Eastern Front, however, let us observe the first clash of modern armies with extreme cold. The Winter War between Finland and the Soviet Union, 1939 until 40, who demonstrated for the first time how hunger and frost could break even powerful armed forces. Already during the Winter War, the frost manifested as assassin. Soviet combatants, frequently originating from southern regions, were not prepared for Arctic conditions. Temperatures descended to -40 degrees Celsius. Snow buried roads, and the human body in such frost consumes many more calories solely to maintain basic body temperature. If a combatant does not receive sufficient nourishment, he weakens rapidly. And this was precisely the case for numerous young Soviets in the forests of Karelia. Frontline supplies collapsed. Long columns of carts with provisions remained blocked in blizzards or were destroyed by Finnish partisans on skis. For Soviet formations encircled in the so-called motti, small pockets cut off from main forces, maintaining life was as difficult as fighting. Numerous froze sitting with rifle in hand. Others suffered hunger. According to Finnish reports, in encircled Red Army encampments appeared cases where desperate military personnel slaughtered the last transport horses and cooked equine meat, solely to consume something. Those who lived it recalled subsequently that the worst was not so much enemy fire as the infinite winter and empty stomach. Finnish combatants fared much better, not that they lived in luxury, but they were accustomed to harsh conditions and had the advantage of being in their homeland. The Finns knew the tricks to survive the frost. Their diet was simple but substantial. Rye bread, dried fish or salted meat, hot porridge of oats or barley from the cauldron. Numerous Finnish combatants carried in pocket a piece of lard or bacon. Fatty nourishment provided energy and in frost hardens less than water, so could be bitten, even frozen. Popular was also a hot beverage similar to coffee, although there were no real coffee beans. The Finns prepared substitute coffee with rye or chicory, which had horrible taste but was hot and provided sense of comfort. Military personnel frequently prepared it in small thermoses or mess tins on fire when they had a quiet moment. Not always, however, was there time and possibility to cook hot nourishment. Mobile kitchens with cauldrons had to operate concealed. In this content, you will discover how even small smoke from fire could signify death. Snipers and Finnish saboteurs lay in ambush for Soviet formations attempting to light a fire. According to records from a Soviet political commissar's diary, his men were harshly punished when they lit fires to warm themselves and heat nourishment. Finnish shooters hidden in trees dispersed every hearth with fire. On white snow, dark figures of military personnel were an easy target. Let us imagine the situation. You are a frozen Red Army soldier, stomach rumbling. In the cauldron, you have frozen porridge. Finally, you risk lighting some twigs. The small flame licks the cauldron and suddenly projectiles whistle around. Nothing remains but to extinguish the fire and consume cold. Or better, not consume at all. So cruel was the choice of numerous military personnel in winter 1939, until 40, the Finns used frost to their advantage. Their ski formations performed swift sorties, attacked, detained the enemy for some hours, and then disappeared again into dark woods. After 2 hours in frozen action, Finnish shooters withdrew to prepared cabins or bunkers where warmth, nourishment, and even sauna awaited them. The Finns had field saunas at the front where military personnel could warm themselves, wash, and regain strength. Saunas and hot nourishment fundamentally improved morale. The Finns recounted that 4 hours of bed rest with a bowl of hot broth worked miracles. On the contrary, encircled Soviet combatants spent frozen nights in improvised trenches without adequate nourishment, frequently in wet clothes. No wonder losses from cold and exhaustion were enormous. The Winter War showed so clearly that lack of nourishment in winter kills as reliably as projectiles. Historians report that thousands of Soviet combatants died of hypothermia and hunger before a Finnish projectile could strike them. Although the Finns ultimately had to conclude peace and cede territory, they morally emerged victorious from this clash. A small country resisted enormous armed forces, thanks to determination, knowledge of territory, and also the fact that its military personnel did not die of hunger. In this content shortly, you will discover how teachings from the harsh Finnish winter were not utilized by Hitler, when a year later he sent his military personnel into even greater frosts on the Eastern Front. It is written December 1941. German Armed Forces Wehrmacht pushed deeply into Soviet territory within the framework of Operation Barbarossa. Hitler's combatants have already conquered vast territories, but Moscow still resists. And then General Winter arrives. It strikes with force, temperatures between 1941 and 42 descend to minus 30 degrees Celsius. Wind lashes the frozen earth and from sky falls snow. The Germans had departed in light uniforms, destined for summer blitzkrieg, suddenly find themselves facing the same nightmare that struck the French in 1812, Field Marshal von Bock, on 30 November 1941, presumably wrote in diary, "The frost has intensified. No winter equipment has arrived. The food situation worsens." While Soviet defenders of Moscow receive padded jackets and felt boots, the legendary Valenki, numerous Germans still wear thin summer blouses and leather boots hardened by frost. To warm themselves and raise morale, Command begins distributing alcohol to combatants, 1 bottle of schnapps brandy per squad. Similarly to how Russian combatants received 100 grams of vodka from People's Commissar per day, the Germans too knew that a shot of strong brandy, at least for a moment, chased away piercing cold and provided courage. But alcohol alone did not feed. Empty stomach continued to ache. How appeared, therefore, the nutrition of German combatant in Russian winter? Every division had assigned mobile kitchens, nicknamed goulash cannons, which were mobile carts with cauldrons for cooking. In the rear, behind the front, were cooked broths, sauces, and porridges for troops. Ideally, every combatant should receive 1 hot meal per day, usually a dense broth or goulash with potatoes or pasta, plus bread and something for breakfast, coffee substitute and a piece of butter or jam, and cold dinner, for example a slice of salami, cheese, or preserve. Sounds acceptable, but this was valid on paper and in the rear. In reality, in the middle of snowy plains, frequently no mobile kitchen arrived. Supply columns with provisions got stuck. On muddy November roads, automobiles and horse-drawn carts blocked. And when mud hardened into ice, numerous vehicles simply froze midway. Soviet partisans, moreover, attacked rear depots. Combatants in trenches on advanced lines thus remained frequently dependent on contents of their backpacks, and that diminished. Let us imagine a small group of German combatants in trenches near Moscow in January 1942. Snow up to waist, frost around minus 30 degrees Celsius. A young rifleman extracts from bag his daily bread ration. He had received in morning a quarter loaf, about 250 grams, which should last entire day. Now, evening. That piece of bread is hard as stone, and moreover completely frozen. The young man tries to bite it, but risks breaking teeth. Finally, he prefers breaking bread with rifle butt into smaller pieces. With bread, he has in reserve a preserve of some spreadable cream, perhaps so-called rubesal, turnip cream, or preserved lard, but also preserve is frozen to marrow. The combatant slips it for some minutes under jacket, directly on bare belly, so content warms at least somewhat with body heat. Meanwhile, his companion tries to light a small alcohol stove, like those they began distributing in necessity. A dry alcohol tablet could heat a cup of water for coffee. If flame manages to maintain itself in wind, heating will last long. Before having hot beverage, young rifleman is already swallowing hardened bread with cold lard. Such menu was not exception. In this content, you will discover testimonies according to which some German combatants also chewed pieces of frozen raw bacon or sausages. They needed fats and proteins, even if nourishment was not at all tasty. The more fortunate sometimes managed to have hot nourishment from mobile kitchen. But also, this had problem. Broth frequently froze during transport. According to officer records, cooks had to distribute nourishment directly at cauldrons, because as soon as they filled combatants' mess tins with boiling broth, this, in few minutes in frost, hardened into ice crust. It happened literally that combatant brought mess tin to mouth and broth inside was already semi-solid mush, sometimes even ice. Who hesitated and did not consume it rapidly, ultimately tipped over an iceberg of broth. Combatants learned to literally swallow boiling broth to consume it before it froze. Similarly, tragicomically, went with butter. This in winter transformed into hard, waxy substance that could not be spread. In one testimony, it is reported that butter had to be cut with wood saw because not even knife managed to penetrate it. If someone had jam preserve, usually in frost it crystallized and content recalled lollipop. Calories were lacking and combatants weakened human body and frost burns more energy. German doctors then calculated that combatant needs at minus 30 degrees Celsius comfortably even 4,000 to 5,000 calories per day to not freeze and maintain strength. In reality, numerous formations received barely half. Consequence was malnutrition. Combatants' heads spun rising abruptly. Vision worsened. They were apathetic frostbite and hunger frequently led to resignation. Combatant with severe frostbite to feet no longer thinks of combat, but a fact that wants to sit and rest, and when sits in snow, can fall asleep forever. Of such cases, thousands were registered. Between 1941 and 42, Wehrmacht reported on Eastern Front about 100,000 frostbite cases. Of these, over 14,000 so severe as to end with amputation. By end of that winter, number of frostbitten exceeded 250,000 men. To hungry and frozen armed forces thus began to crumble combat forces without Soviets having to shoot. German officers in field reports described desperate conditions. Combatants reportedly broke frozen potato fields with grenades to dig frozen potatoes to consume. Others killed small animals in woods. Who captured hare or bird became hero of day, but game also diminished rapidly. Frequently, thus came turn of only available game, own army horses. German armed forces depended on horses, used millions to pull carts. As soon, however, oat and hay reserves finished, horses began dying en masse from hunger and frost. Numerous formations tried to save them at least by slaughtering for meat. Paradoxically, thus, horses nourished at least their masters. For example, near Moscow in January 1942, according to memories of German riflemen, formation lost so many horses that men for weeks consumed only equine meat. They prepared dense broth with bit of millet when found any and roasted meat slices directly on fire with bayonets. Another combatant noted cynically that front offered them beef-free, meaning dead Soviet cows found in vicinity. Yes, also dead livestock from Soviet kolkhozs sometimes became prey of hungry aggressors. On other side of front among Soviet combatants was not much merrier, at least initially. Red Army, yes, from October 1941, introduced new daily nourishment rations, for example, 890 grams. Bread, 150 grams meat, 120 grams cereals, 50 grams sugar, etc. per frontline combatant. But reality frequently lagged behind. In chaotic summer 1941 retreat, Soviets lost enormous quantities of reserves. Depots burned and fertile areas of Ukraine and southern Russia fell into enemy hands. Thus, supply crisis struck also defenders. In Moscow, in winter 41-42, numerous Soviet infantrymen fared as badly as aggressors. Difference was that Soviets had nonetheless greater experience with cruel winter, and their leadership managed more rapidly to organize help. From extreme east brought not only hardened Siberian formations, but also millions of warm, padded jackets, ear-flap caps, and felt boots. And with warmth on body better endured also lesser nourishment rations. Moreover, Soviets focused on hot nourishment for all whenever possible. Generals knew hot nourishment in winter is fundamental for morale. Red Army frontline kitchens therefore functioned even at cost of great risk. In darkness at dawn or after sunset. Always when smoke could be concealed, field cook lit fire under cauldron. Soviet mobile kitchen was called mobile kitchen and frequently managed by women, uniformed cooks. When succeeded, prepared for combatants twice daily. Hot nourishment, for example, in morning cereal. Porridge, kasha, and evening dense broth or stewed potatoes with bit of meat. Typical dish was kulesh dense millet broth to which was added whatever was at hand. Piece of bacon meat, preserve onion. Dried vegetables. Popular were also traditional Russian broths like borscht or shchi cabbage broth if ingredients existed. Numerous witnesses recall how incredibly encouraging was receiving bowl of hot porridge or broth in trench. Suddenly, as if frost retreated, body warmed from within and had strength to continue fighting Soviet rations, however, were sometimes also very scarce. Especially in shortage periods, bread doses diminished. For example, during Leningrad defense in winter 1941, until 42 ration for civilians descended to terrible 125 grams. Bread per day, combatants received more about 500 grams. But also, that was peace, not covering at all. Energy expenditure. In besieged Leningrad, combatants had to divide reserves with civilians, and numerous military cooks improvised to feed greatest possible number of hungry mouths. For example, in bread dough were added most varied substitutes: dried carrots, beet peels, wood cellulose. Result was dark blockade bread, which was rubbery, tasted bitter, and contained only part flour. Rest were substitutes. Yet precisely this bread saved thousands of lives, even if more among civilians. Combatants in field usually received at least bread from frontline oven. Soviets also had mobile ovens that baked bread near front. As conflict dragged on, raw materials diminished. Soviet cooks invented beverages like carrot tea, grated boiled carrot with pieces of chaga mushroom, which reportedly gave a Swedish beverage with dark color, recalling tea. Instead of coffee, drank barley decoction. Also arrived at experiments with baked products. For example, in Izhev region, baked bread from boiled and ground potatoes mixed with bran and salt. Taste: nothing special, but satisfied. On both sides of front, thus first conflict winter revealed unpleasant truth. No armed forces are stronger than their stomach, Germans learned with horror of having underestimated winter reserve preparation. Soviets instead discovered that even enormous agricultural reserves can, during few months of war, devastation disappear and armed forces find themselves facing hunger. But frost test was not at all finished. Other winters brought new horrors, and most terrible hunger arrived in winter. 1942-43, on Volga shore in city ruins that became symbol of human resistance. Shortly, we will reveal what consumed and sometimes did not consume combatants in besieged Stalingrad, where winter and hunger united in infernal combination. I have nothing good to write you about me. For a long time they have not provided us meat nor fats. I think always only of nourishment. At night, from hunger, cannot sleep, stomach contracts. Some days ago, 2 dogs ran past one I shot, but was terribly emaciated. Thus, wrote in September 1942 to one of his dear ones, a German combatant besieged in Stalingrad. These phrases from letter that never arrived at recipient was discovered later in wreckage of shot-down aircraft attempting to transport mail from encirclement describe eloquently what implacable hunger tormented combatants already at beginnings of Stalingrad battle. And that was only September. Winter was only approaching Battle of Stalingrad. Summer 1942, February 1943 was conflict turning point and simultaneously one of the most tragic episodes regarding human suffering. In autumn 1942, situation of German 6th Army of General Paulus worsened each day. Soviets began 19 November encirclement Operation Uranus and in few days closed pincers around city. There remained trapped about 290,000 German and Allied combatants, including Italian, Romanian, and Hungarian formations. With them, some thousand civilians. Russian city inhabitants who survived street fighting and also numerous wounded in field hospitals. All these suddenly remained without regular supply of provisions. Began 3 months' siege and winter struck cruelly. December 1942 and January 1943 brought temperatures around minus 25 degrees Celsius. Snow blizzards alternated with frozen and serene days, and inside Stalingrad cauldron, meanwhile, people suffered hunger we can barely imagine. German command promised to supply 6th Army by air. Each day should fly into cauldron dozens of transport aircraft with ammunition, medicine, fuel, and also provisions. But Luftwaffe did not succeed. Soviets had anti-aircraft defense. Weather frequently prevented flights and aircraft capacity did not suffice. Instead of necessary 500 tons supplies per day, encircled frequently received only about 100 tons, sometimes even less. And priority had projectiles and fuel. On nourishment was economized. Initially, in November, depots in Stalingrad were still full, but tens of thousands hungry mouths emptied them soon. From December began rations descending to minimum. Daily bread dose was reduced to 200 grams per man, later even less. 200 grams are about 5 thin slices, which, for combatant working hard not to mention frost, is pitifully little. Bread, moreover, was of ever-worsening quality ground from emergency mixture of wheat and corn, sometimes extended with barley flour. Mobile ovens baked until last moment, but wheat finished around January. Meat initially was available mainly as preserves. Each German formation should have preserve reserve, so-called Eisern portion iron ration containing, for example, preserved beef known as bully beef, similar to our luncheon meat. During encirclement, these iron rations were rapidly consumed. Then came turn of local meat source again, horses. In December 6th, Army still possessed about 10,000 horses in various transport and artillery formations. But grenades and hunger rapidly decimated horses. Numerous fell because there was no fodder for them. Those remaining then were by commander's orders gradually slaughtered and distributed as nourishment to troops. From equine meat were cooked broth, goulash, and so-called Eintopf one-pot stew. Combatants consumed boiled, roasted, and even frozen raw equine meat. Officers tried to maintain at least appearance of normal cooking. Christmas Eve, 1942, presumably in several formations, combatants received goulash pretending to be beef, but all knew were their own horses. Another recipe was equine meat with cereal addition, if any still existed. Regiment Chronicle reports at New Year cooked festive pilaf with equine meat and millet. Naturally was more desperation than delicacy. Despite hunger, some combatants tried maintaining black humor. In letters and diaries appear cynical observations. For example, German combatant from Stalingrad Cauldron described his Christmas menu thus: "First feast day, we had goose with rice. Second day, goose with peas. For long time have always only goose meat. Only our geese have 4 legs, and on those horseshoes." With that joke indicated consumed horses but called them geese because sounded better. Add that according to same letter, taste of that meat was naturally horrible, but combatants pretended to feast only to give themselves morale, but horses could not feed such quantity men indefinitely. One day was around mid-January 1943. In Cauldron remained no more live horse. Everything had been consumed. Beyond could consume only skins and bones. And truly, testimonies of German prisoners after battle report combatants cut equine skins from fallen animals and boiled them in pots with water, obtaining kind of skin broth full of glue. Someone tried roasting even equine hooves. Also, in Leningrad, people stripped hooves of tissue remains. When horses finished, came turn of dogs and cats. Stalingrad ruins were full of stray animals that survived bombardments. Emaciated dogs and cats searched like people, something to consume. For hungry combatants, however, these 4-legged companions ultimately were victims. Numerous dogs were shot and consumed. An above-cited letter combatant complained of having shot dog, but that was too thin. This shows in what state already were animals and people. Even dog skin and bones no longer represented nourishing prey. Combatants' state drastically worsened. Numerous suffered severe malnutrition and hunger diseases. Appeared scurvy from vitamin C, lack dysentery from spoiled foods, and generally reduced immunity. People died of infections that in normal circumstances would have overcome. For example, simple influenza or pneumonia. In combination with starvation, killed hundreds men per day. Some combatants collapsed from nowhere, stood guard, and suddenly without shots, fell dead. Sadly, famous episode was German command attempt to provide combatants superfood special concentrated meat paste. At end of year 1942, when was clear, combatants desperately lacked calories. Supreme Command ordered sending to Stalingrad novelty. Preserves with very fatty meat concentrate should provide energy for some combat hours. But happened tragic effect. Organisms of starved combatants could no longer digest such high-fat content. Shortly after began consuming this paste, combatants began mysteriously dying, simply collapsed and were dead without apparent cause. German doctors in encirclement discovered cause were liver and pancreas insufficiencies. Body weakened by hunger did not withstand fat assault and internal organs gave way. Immediately, this improved nourishment was withdrawn, but cost lives to numerous poor combatants. Also, this shows what extreme conditions prevailed in Stalingrad. Attempt to help paradoxically harmed. In January 1943, 6th Army remains withdrew into small sectors in Stalingrad ruins. They're no longer cooked at all. Were practically no provisions. Who had last reserves guarded them with weapon in hand. Appeared even desperation cases going beyond taboo. Exist hints that precisely at end, some individuals attempted utilizing even human remains as nourishment. Cannibalism in Stalingrad was never officially documented among German combatants, unlike, for example, besieged Leningrad, where among civilians probably occurred. But Soviet sources after conflict reported that in several cellars found remains suggesting this horror. However, hunger arrived at extreme. When 2 February 1943 remaining German formations capitulated, Soviets found men reduced to death limit from hunger. Numerous prisoners weighed third less than when entered Stalingrad. Soviet officer recalled that in ruins found skeletons of combatants who were still alive. People so weak could not raise arms. In field hospitals lay hundreds wounded, slowly dying of hunger. Rations for wounded were indeed lowest. Unproductive eaters had no priority. Soviet doctors immediately provided prisoners hot water broth and dry bread. Prisoners threw themselves on nourishment so avidly that had to restrain them, risked dying consuming too much. Truly, paradoxically sudden consuming can kill malnourished person. Today called refeeding syndrome. Therefore, victors had to feed their enemies with caution. Ice, hell of Stalingrad. Hunger wrote itself in history as warning never before nor after so many combatants passed through such extreme privations in so little time. To illustrate, of 290,000 original encircled survived captivity. Ultimately, only about 5,000 men. Majority died either already in combat, or from hunger and cold consequences during a journey to captivity camps. Hunger killing perhaps more people than projectiles, and not only Germans. Also, Stalingrad civilians suffered hunger and numerous perished. On other side, also, Soviet city defenders in early battle phases suffered hunger, consumed horses and cats. Stalingrad defenders' heroism frequently mentions their determination to resist, although were at exhaustion limit and in stomach had only handful millet per day. After Stalingrad, both sides realized food logistics had to be improved. Soviets from spring 1943 introduced better supply routes, more mobile kitchens, and also began flowing Allied aid Germans instead in rest of conflict no longer undertook major winter offensive. This, however, does not mean combatants no longer suffered cold and hunger in lesser measure. Still in winter, 1943-44 for example, Germans besieged near Cherkasy, Korsun, Shevchenkovsky. Operation in Ukraine lived second smaller Stalingrad. Again encircled by Soviets in frost, again emergency air supply, and again consumed horses. Numerous combatants there reportedly consumed with gratitude even cereals destined for horses only swelled in water and considered it delicacy compared to nothing. Similarly, Italian armed forces formations on Eastern Front lived winter collapse. In January 1943, parallel to Stalingrad. Thousands. Italians beat retreat from Don River in snow blizzards without nourishment. Italian officers desperately sought provisions from abandoned villages. Some Italian veterans recall had to steal nourishment from local civilians to not die. Took sacks, potatoes, beets, homemade preserves, sometimes even live poultry. Naturally, for local inhabitants was tragedy, but combatants in that desperation resorted to anything. Combatants of so-called Armor Italian armed forces in Russia had no winter equipment at all, and numerous fell from exhaustion and hunger. During retreat, still today in Italy spoken of as White Death. Some survivors testified later survived only thanks to incredible cases, for example found abandoned depot with barrel sauerkraut, or stumbled upon dead horse from which obtained some kilos meat. While on Eastern Front fought other winters rather on Soviet advance, which does not mean did not suffer, but relations changed. Red Army strengthened and Germans withdrew. Let us observe also how Allies in West and elsewhere resolved winter nutrition. Also, there indeed combatants lived harsh moments in frosts, for example in Ardennes battle or Italian mountains. We will discover American and British armed forces had own types provisions for winter, and also narratives of human solidarity facing cold. At end of year 1944, seemed Nazi power would soon fall. Allied armed forces advanced in France and liberated Belgium. But in December, Hitler struck for last time, undertook Ardennes offensive, Ardennes wooded region on Belgium. Luxembourg border became theater of unexpectedly harsh battle known as Ardennes Battle or Bulge Battle, and moreover arrived coldest European December in numerous years. Temperature descended deeply below zero by day, snowed and by night froze. American combatants there facing desperate German attack suffered not only from fire but also from cold, almost as bad as what their adversaries knew in East. Particularly harsh were for 101st U.S. Airborne Division, which was encircled in Bastogne town. There, repeat situation similar to small Stalingrad combatants in encirclement few reserves Arctic weather. Americans, however, had advantage. Encirclement did not last so long, only about 1 week, and had from beginning certain air superiority. When weather permitted, aircraft dropped at least some provisions. However, first days were cut off and nourishment scarce. How appeared American nourishment at our? American armed forces entered conflict equipped with various ration types. For combat conditions were designed, for example, K rations, individual packets for 1 day, or C rations, canned foods in tins. Combatants in Ardennes typically had combination these rations. K ration contained, for example, some biscuits, chocolate bar, small cheese preserve, or luncheon meat, something like luncheon meat. Spam, instant coffee, packet, bit, sugar, and cigarettes. C rations were larger preserves, for example, pork with beans, stewed beef, or goulash. Those were destined for heating on fire. But in Bastogne, snowy forests was problem lighting fire-dry wood scarce and smoke attracted enemy attention. German artillery sometimes bombarded areas from which saw smoke because intuited there gathered Americans around fire. In first encirclement days, thus, numerous paratroopers consumed their rations cold. From pork, with beans preserve in frost, became hard. Fatty mass had to excavate with knife. Beans were like ice pellets in fat. Some resolved putting preserve under jacket or sitting on it with own warmth content softened somewhat. 101st Division combatant recalled that with cold beans directly from tin made cheers. Christmas Eve instead of toast. Others recounted chewed hard candies and chewing gums from rations to at least deceive stomach. To warm, drank instant coffee, poured it in mouth, and swallowed with cold water or snow, because making hot water was difficult. Was bitter cold coffee, but caffeine had effect. Despite this, also in Bastogne found moments humanity and menu improvement. Famous is narrative of combatant who Christmas Eve shared his last chocolate piece with German prisoner, or little story, how helped Belgian civilians. Numerous local Bastogne inhabitants hid in cellars, and also they suffered hunger. But some shared with American combatants that little they had, veteran Keith Davis of 101st Division recalled. We're at Bastogne margins discovered farm. Inside were man, woman, and 2 children. That lady provided us broth and black bread, remained with them for night. Outside raged conflict, and that house by miracle was not struck. Was Christmas Eve. Sang with that Belgian family. Silent night and jingle bells. Words were different, but melody was same. This moving memory shows how precious was for frozen and tired combatants receiving bowl, hot, homemade broth. Davis even said that was best dinner of his life. Ordinary vegetable broth and bread slice, but in that moment meant world. Some days later, situation improved. 26 December American tanks broke through Bastogne encirclement and brought first supplies. Aircraft began dropping parachutes with nourishment crates. Combatants' joy knew no limits. Threw themselves for crates with K rations, chocolates, preserves. Even arrived mail with packages from home. Some unwrapped late Christmas gifts containing, for example, homemade sweets from mothers. With humor proper to them, paratroopers teased companions. You, however, have luck having received socks, not strudel. That would have consumed here an instant. American Armed Forces from Ardennes, experiences learned and introduced in following years better winter nourishment. Already then, however, had tested medicine against cold. Hot chicken broth. Commanders knew nothing raises morale like hot nourishment whenever possible. Mobile kitchens also in Ardennes cooked broths. For example, combatant Malcolm Buck Marsh of 3rd Armored Division described how stood guard in blizzards during storm, and from nearby house emerged Belgian grandmother with 2 cups hot chicken broth for him and his colleague. Was best nourishment of my life, recalled Marsh 75 years later. And that was Alabama, native land of good nourishment. Cup broth at right moment surpassed all world stakes because meant survival. Not only Americans, but also British and Canadians fought in winter 1944 until 45. In Holland and Western Germany prevailed harsh winter British combatant, then had daily ration as rich as American. British were in supplies perhaps even more generous. Their field rations contained, for example, canned bacon, biscuits, tea, sugar-powdered milk, and for more festive moments also rum. British armed forces had long tradition of rum ration administration in cold weather. Drop rum morning or evening should warm and raise mood, although really alcohol rather constricts vessels and cools body psychologically. However, helps combatants at the Christmas front. 1944 received from command also small luxuries, for example, Christmas pudding preserve or extra cigarettes. But this does not mean did not suffer cold. Canadians near Rhine reported frostbite and so-called trench foot. Painful foot state from humidity and cold in which extremities swell and tissues can die. Against this nourishment does not help much, but hot nourishment at least prevented general hypothermia. British combatants maintained morale, also observing tea breaks. Even under fire, found moments to cook in pot. Strong tea with milk and sometimes with rum pinch. This ritual warmed them and reminded them home. Merits mention also struggle in high mountains during conflict. For example, between 1944 and 45 American 10th Mountain Division fought in Italian Apennines. There, combatants climbed snowy slopes where temperatures descended to minus 20 degrees Celsius. Their supply was difficult, frequently had to carry everything on mule backs or combatants' shoulders. Americans therefore developed special mountaineering rations, lightened high-energy provisions, packets, chocolate bars, dried meat, nuts, dried milk, and compact sugar cubes. In mountains proved useful also. So-called mountain menu, 5-in-1. Nourishment, crate for 5 men for 1 day containing, for example, concentrated broth. Packet pea or potato broth. Powder could be mixed in boiling water. Moreover, fruit preserves biscuits and instant coffee. These lightened rations had advantage not freezing so rapidly. Dry things remain friable. 10th Division combatants thus in morning fortified with hot instant broth and evening, for example, with hot chocolate if camped. Naturally, sometimes did not work and consumed snow with chocolate, literally breakfasted with chocolate ice cream. Mixed handful snow with cocoa powder and sugar from ration. Also, such little stories circulate among veterans. Even more extreme frosts lived some American and Canadian combatants on Aleutian Islands near Alaska, where in 1943 fought with Japanese Kiska and Attu Islands had subarctic climate frost, snow blizzards, and fogs. Here, combatants learned weapon sometimes warms more easily than nourishment. Reported M1. Garand rifles shooting heated barrel so much placed hands to defrost fingers and thus heated also nourishment tins. Sometimes sufficed shooting long enough and combatant then from barrel, which was hot licked, melted snow, improvised hot beverage. These harsh experiences brought armed forces to developing special cold rations after conflict. But this is another narrative. Cannot omit still one winter nutrition aspect, psychological effect. Hot and tasty nourishment can motivate combatants while monotonous diet and hunger undermine morale. In winter 1944-45, therefore, Allied armed forces did what could to grant their men at least sometimes something good. Extra, liberating Belgium and France. Americans, for example, had possibility buying fresh cheeses, eggs or vegetables from locals, although officially not supported. Happened barter trade spam preserve for potato basket, etc. British instead organized mobile ovens, baking fresh bread for frontline formations even in frosts, and sometimes distributed fresh sweets sent from home in sealed boxes. Worth mentioning, curious situation. Enemy meeting around nourishment. In Ardennes happened several small truces when combatants both sides because winter and holidays did not initiate fire. For example, registered cases were Americans and Germans. Christmas Eve, 1944, lay each at own wood's edge and sang Christmas carols heard reciprocally their voices in night. In morning, however, fighting continued. Also known narrative of German mother living in woods hut near Monschau, who at Christmas provided shelter to 3 American combatants and 3 Germans together, consumed together. Her modest dinner, roast potatoes and vegetables, and agreed for truce for holiday's duration. This episode beautifully illustrates shared nourishment can for a moment overcome even war hatred, especially facing harsh winter uniting. All in survival struggle. Second World War left numerous tragic but also instructive narratives. Combatants' winter privations belong to those should not be forgotten. Each armed force from these experiences carried away precious lessons for future. After conflict, military planners occupied themselves detailedly with question. What do so never again combatants must suffer hunger and cold like in Stalingrad or Ardennes? Direct consequence was military rations improvement. Armed forces began developing special field nourishment for extreme conditions. For example, in 50s, an American Armed Forces born special Arctic rations from which then developed concept. We know today dried, dehydrated foods for individuals suffices pouring with hot water. Such nourishment has advantage, does not freeze completely because contains no water, does not spoil with frost, and above all has high energy value. In small volume, modern combatant thus can carry in backpack nourishment for several days without fearing become ice bricks. Also, discovered combatant in frost needs many more calories. Today, standard recommendation for armed forces at temperatures below zero is up to 4,500 calories per day compared to about 3,000 calories in mild climate. Modern rations therefore contain more fats and carbohydrates. But instructed from Stalingrad episode do not exaggerate. Everything balanced so organism manages. Package part are also vitamin supplements, for example vitamin C, against scurvy and enough salt and other minerals because sweating in heavy winter equipment can drain salt from body. Another teaching is hot nourishment logistics. Armed forces today develop mobile kitchens with better fuels. For example, wind-protected stoves, chemical food heaters, etc. Exist self-heating packets. In modern MRE rations, meal ready to eat. Find, for example, packet with chemical heater, in which insert main dish and pour bit water. In few minutes happens exothermic reaction and nourishment is hot without lighting visible fire. Is invention that to combatants near Leningrad or Bastogne would seem miracle. Current armed forces also place emphasis on combatant survival training. Also, today's combatants within Allied exercises train in Arctic conditions. Learn how build snow shelter, how light fire in frost, how melt snow for water, how heat preserve on vehicle engine, and similar. These abilities once combatants painfully acquired directly in field today prefer learning beforehand at training ground to prevent useless losses. Winter nutrition history and conflict also has cultural impacts. For example, famous Spam preserve pork mixture became legend precisely thanks to Second World War. Americans provided it not only to own formations, but also to allies, especially British and Soviets. Nikita Khrushchev. Soviet leader then declared without Spam would not have sustained our armed forces. Lost our most fertile areas. This declaration shows how precious was for Soviets receiving tons preserves from West when their agriculture suffered for conflict. Soviet combatants grew so fond of Spam, nicknamed it Second Front. Bit jokingly said, while true, Second Front Allied invasion in Europe not yet seen anywhere, American preserves already fought from them against hunger. After conflict Spam and other preserved foods spread among civilians and influenced also post-war cuisine. People realized value of preserves and dried foods for crisis situations. Today's combatants naturally do not suffer hunger like their grandfathers in 40s. Logistics immensely improved but still valid that extreme winter conditions are challenge. Also, modern conflicts in Afghanistan mountains or exercises in polar areas show frost and snow know how complicate supplies. Must still be careful nourishment, not freeze. For example, chocolate energy bars carried near body so remain soft, and care hydration regime. Melt snow for water, because dehydration in winter not so perceptible but dangerous. For all us who today, in home warmth, make tea and have refrigerator full of nourishment. Combatants' narratives in Second World War. Winter are instructive in several aspects. First of all, realize how important, not forget ordinary human needs, even in extraordinary times. Bread, peace, and broth dish can decide armed forces' morale. Second, can admire tenacity and inventiveness of those young men and women. Also, women were in armed forces as auxiliaries who managed surviving in conditions we barely manage. Imagining, third, narratives on nourishment, sharing between enemies or civilian help. Remind that even in conflict midst people maintained humanity drop, and hot nourishment at common table can, for moment, stop even conflict. When today, see military museum with mobile kitchen displayed or taste military preserve at battle, reconstruction can remember all those nameless cooks and combatants thanks to whom others fed and survived another day. Each broth bowl was a small victory over winter, and each bread bite combatant shared with companion was proof of solidarity stronger than frost. I sincerely thank you for following to conclusion this frozen narrative. I believe this excursion into winter war nutrition interested you, and perhaps also inspired gratitude for our today's comfort. If content pleased you and discovered something new, we'll be happy if put like and share it with other enthusiasts of these stories. I warmly invite you to subscribe to channel to not miss other compelling narratives like this. Each your support gesture helps us continue bringing you extraordinary narratives from past. See you at next episode.